Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today, hosted by AlixPartners and Redwood Logistics. We are going to be talking about driving efficiency in the transportation ecosystem through technology. We're going to be covering three major discussion areas. One is a 2025 market update, followed by a 2026 outlook. And then we'll get into, I think, the most interesting part of this discussion. It's going to be how to leverage technology to drive ecosystem efficiency. So as we get started, I'm going to introduce the panelists today. I'm joined today by Jeff Lepart and Mark Iampieri. Jeff is an executive vice president with Redwood Logistics, and Mark is a partner and managing director at AlixPartners. I'm James Rowe. I'll be your moderator today. Jeff and Mark are both industry veterans and have spent over 20 years in the transportation industry. And I think the most exciting thing about both of them is that they've spent time with both carriers and shippers, right? So they've seen this market and the market dynamics from both the shipper side and the carrier side. And I think that's incredibly important when we think about, driving efficiencies together and driving out waste out of the ecosystem. So with that, I'll let Jeff and Mark introduce their respective companies. Jeff, we'll start with you.
Sure. Again, thanks for having me today. And Redwood Logistics is a modern 4PL. And we've really focused the past couple of years on merging the various technologies and technology ecosystems that are out there with a North American freight execution platform and expertise. And we've designed custom solutions for our customers' dynamic supply chains.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. And Mark, can you introduce your company as well?
Great. Thanks, James. Happy to be here. So AlixPartners was founded in 1981 by our founder, Jay Alix, and we are a global advisory and consulting services firm that help companies achieve the financial and performance outcomes that they're looking to produce. In the context of today's discussion, similar to Jeff, we work with transportation and logistics service providers and their customers, and seek to get the most out of both sides of the relationship. So happy to be here and look forward to our discussion.
All right. Well, with that, let's get into our first discussion topic, which is the 2025 truckload market. And I have a first chart here for you to discuss. And, quite frankly, it looks rather boring, but I think you can both provide some commentary to that. So this is the DAT Dry Van Index for North America in 2025, showing both contract and spot. Jeff, I'll kick it off to you. Is this representative of what you and Redwood Logistics are seeing in the market in 2025
Yeah, a couple of key takeaways here is just obviously there may be some people on the call that just want clarity between the two, but contract is usually an agreed to price for a trade lane in the truckload space, and spot is by very definition is something that's not contractual by time or an agreed to price and is agreed to at the time of the transaction. We traditionally see a lot of volatility in the spot, and the contract remains through whatever that time frame is, traditionally about a year. We've seen shortened time frames as it relates to the current freight cycle we're in, but I want to kind of separate the two of them and why the delta between the two is so important. You'll see the delta pinches a little bit toward the end of the year, which is starting to show some of the things that Mark and I will talk about today as it relates to the supply constraints and profitability in the industry. But I think my biggest takeaway for this slide for everybody is kind of 2 points. The first point is you're starting to see that there is no volatility, and we're on kind of a 3 and almost 4 year journey with lack of volatility. We should see more. That has a lot to do with the demand and supply economics in the dry van industry and ecosystem. And then the second thing is obviously you look at cycles, and right now this should be contracting like it is because of the fact that we're in what we consider to be a peak season with an end of year inventory push to either an end consumer for a Christmas season rush or an end of year closeout. So the contraction here is actually, I think, a byproduct of both those things. It's a supply concern that we may have, but also just a time of the year. We are in peak season.
And speaking of that, Jeff, the peak season, Mark, from your perspective, is this a strong peak season, or has this peak season been relatively muted compared to years past?
Yeah, well, years past is a hard benchmark because we've been sideways like this for quite some time, coming out of a very dynamic COVID period where things were off the charts, inconsistent, and hard to predict what was going to happen. But we've had stability. So when I look at this chart, I'm thinking we have stability, and we've had it for, as Jeff mentioned, certainly over 2 years now, because of consumer preferences and just the new way I think people consume has been spread out over such a long period of time. The peak season that we knew from before, that's holiday driven, and it's holiday driven for different holidays, but the end of the year holidays had driven a significant amount of peak season and disruption to operations. Tariffs certainly did that previously. Lack of capacity and container imports, being in the wrong place certainly led to that. But again, we've had this stability for over 2 years now. And even the shift from 18 to 14% and kind of closing the gap, if you look at this chart, it's a snooze alert. It's straight across, and it's going to continue to be that way unless something gives, which, usually happens less than 12 months. And we're going on the 3rd year now of nothing really happening to change that dynamic.
All right, Mark, I'm going to stop you there. I don't want to get into 2026 too much before we get over there. I know a lot of the audience here is probably interested to hear that, but just to provide them a little bit more context in, what's happening in 2025 and really how remarkable the kind of boring chart is. What I've done here is I've overlaid the 2020 spot rate here in green, and you can see it's basically at parity when including fuel for both of those. And this is obviously 2020. This is prior to the pandemic, explosion in the freight market. So, what does this mean? And I'm going to wait one more. So, if we take fuel out, you even see that our current spot rate, excluding fuel, is now below what we saw in 2020. So how remarkable is this really when we think about the cost pressures that some of these carriers have faced in the last 5 years? Jeff, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of points here. Again, I would tell you that the spot market skyrocketed, to your point, to 270 after once the pandemic hit. So that's really when a lot of the shift changed as it relates to pricing behaviors and capacity behaviors. But what the great thing here is you get to correlate where we're at now to where we were before. So I love the slice of time comparing the two of them. But you bring up two fantastic points. The first point is that in the last 5 years, trucking companies have seen cost increase north of 30%, whether it's insurance, labor, just basically cost of oil, cost of gas. The costs have gone up, and they have to manage that, which speaks to our point, the kind of, and our theme throughout the day is that the rate volatility isn't there and the overall climbing of rates isn't there. So only the strong survive right now, is because we're kind of on outside of the pandemic cut, you're kind of in a 2020 to 2025 comparison. And there isn't a lot of volatility, and costs have gone up. And the only other carve out I would make is obviously fuel is the number one expense for all modes of transportation, whether it's an ocean, a steamship line, an airline, a truck, a railroad. They have to pay attention. And we have an executive office right now that is energy tolerant, and they want more and more production, and it's going to help keep the costs down, which is great as it relates to the cost economic, but it's actually usually is also a stimulant in raising rates. As rates go up, as fuel goes up, rates go up. But because we've had such an energy tolerant output of oil in the United States, I would tell you that this is actually, it's kind of one of those double-edged swords where costs are down, but it's not creating any volatility, which is why these lines are so muted.
And Mark, based on what you've seen with your clients, do you anticipate any more room for rates to go down, or are we kind of at a point now where carriers' costs have increased and there's just not a lot more runway there?
Well, listen, the for-hire one-way U.S. truckload market pricing is 100% driven by what the market will bear, right? Contract dedicated, where it's closed loop and you buy the committed assets. Okay, there's a cost structure in place. So it's a long-winded way to say there's always more room, right? But there's consequences to doing that. So you sign up, and we saw it during COVID. We saw it across all modes. You sign up for a rate that's not market competitive and the market turns. Good luck trying to enforce your contract. Even if it's a take or pay, there's challenges of enforcing contracts. So yes, there's room to go down. but I don't know if that's really where the value is. I think the value for both the carriers and their customers, and customers that really want to have a partnership with a core group, not for all of their freight, but for the bulk of it, to talk about what they need to do to lock in a rate that they can live with for the next year, or perhaps even 18 months, and the carrier to be able to survive, and for them to feel like they're getting a good service for a fair price. But $1.67, right? Considering that inflation has impacted everything other than fuel, which is, a big deal, but still the inflation in wages and tires and insurance, maintenance, the wages for mechanics, the real estate cost, everything has gone up materially. And so the carriers are really hurting. There's probably another penny per mile. I don't know if that's where my efforts would go. I think it would be locking up stronger relationships with my suppliers for the future.
Right. Before we jump into what's going to happen in 2026, I do want to touch on the LTL market. Jeff, Mark, you both know this is a market with different fundamentals as compared to the truckload market. Here you can see what we've seen as far as increases go across the past 4 years or so. Jeff, I'll open it up to you. What do you see here, and how has the LTL market performed relative to the truckload market?
This is, again, it's a great mode. It's important to focus on. It's completely different than truckload. I mean, completely different than truckload. I think the biggest thing for the LTL network is it's an asset-rich environment. So those are fixed networks that they're moving on. They have real estate expenses, they have terminal expenses, they have capital expenditures for trucks and trailers that are fluid within their network. And everything Mark also mentioned, they have inflationary pressures as it relates to labor, insurance, benefits, strong competition. This is also a narrowed community as it relates to how many people are in this space. And so there's probably about 20 to 25 carriers that manage about 90% of the overall LTL network. And so saying all that I just said, it's important to carve out why the rates are raising in this space. And the reason the rates are raising in this space is, again, they have more expenses that they need to manage, and lowering rates for them, they don't have another revenue income stream. It's their network, it's their business, and their costs are going up, so they're raising rates. Now, the key call out here is that you'll see that there's a little bit of a calming or a deacceleration, if you will, of the ability for what Mark said was what will the market bear, right? And so they're starting to see a headwind in what the market will bear for these rates, because the shippers do have a little bit of leverage if you have tonnage, because no different than the truckload side of the fence, the LTL carriers are posting some pretty negative tonnage year-over-year comps, and are thirsting for the industrial industry to come back, the auto industry to come back, and for the truckload market to come back, because there is a ton of LTL freight in the truckload market right now on dedicated and private fleets. So they're thirsting for that tonnage, which is the reason why that you're seeing that year-over-year comp from 5 to 1, is because they're just pushing the top boundary of what the market will bear.
That's an interesting point, Jeff, and I think that's good to articulate to the audience here, is that due to these depressed truckload rates, we're seeing shippers leverage the truckload market for shipments where, given a higher rate, they might be an LTL, right? If that break point was traditionally called 12,000 pounds, that might be down to 8,000 pounds now. So as we see the truckload rate go up, that could also mean, shifting volume from truckload to LTL. Mark, what are you seeing here? And are you hearing anything from your clients' perspective on, as far as LTL rates decreasing recently, or are they still going up? What's your take on that?
Yeah. So listen, Jeff made a pretty important point. This is trucking, but it's a different segment of trucking. It's driven by different factors. Industrial production is something we track for LTL. Housing starts is something more for truckload. These are well-capitalized, more sophisticated businesses that run complex networks. They handle the reduction in tonnage by trading up for better freight. So we've seen actual yields go up. We've seen pricing go up for some customers, but the volume, the demand's just not there. So, financial performance hasn't been where these companies want it to be, but they're playing the long game. A lot of the participants in the U.S. truckload market are not in it for the long game. There's a lot of small owner operators and very small fleets that got in during COVID, made some money, and are still hanging on. they're the first to fall out. They don't have a a strong balance sheet of any type. A lot of those LTL providers that make up this index have capitalized on all the terminals for sale from Yellow Corp, and they're expanding right now. They're spending money now in a time where we're saying it's kind of a tough market because they know it's going to come back, and they're positioning themselves to have a greater geographic coverage and to make their network more efficient for those customers. But pricing is still moving sideways in LTL, just like as in truckload, just for slightly different reasons.
Okay, so if I summarize, what's been happening in 2025, it's been a flat market. Rates are down. They're down historically, even though cost inputs for the carriers have been up. And even the LTL, though it's rates aren't necessarily down, LTL moving sideways and not having that traditional 5 to 6% increase year over year is also a result of negative tonnage, Jeff, as you mentioned. So with that, let's get into 2026. And we have an illustrative chart here. I want to call that out to the audience here. By no means is this an exact prediction that Redwood and AlixPartners are signing up for. I think the entire market has tried to predict what's going to happen in the truckload market for the past 3 years and have gotten it wrong year after year. But with that said, I think it's illustrative of what could potentially happen. So Jeff, what are you seeing here, and can you help explain why we've kind of come up with this potential outlook?
Yeah. A lot of times we'll say things like the back half of next year, the back half of next year, the back half of next year. You kind of try and forecast and hope. But I will say this, obviously the most likely is going to be the black line, but I would tell you that the green line, not when, but I would tell you that the trend line of it going up or changing, we kind of have the collision of events that is starting to produce itself right now in the truckload space. We're starting to see we comment a lot on the slide here about it, but we're starting to see the supply side of the trucking ecosystem really struggle. They're struggling to post a profit. Another concern we have in that space is what I would consider, we have fraud. That's a whole different topic, but we have a generational problem where dad started trucking companies or grandpa started trucking companies, and they're trying to either transition it to a younger generation that isn't interested, and they can't sell it, so they're just shutting down. So we have a generational or a transfer of that said capacity into the supply side. That's not happening. It's become very expensive, and we've already talked, at length about what's happening at rates and how muted they have been for years. I would tell you that the pressure is finally starting to show that the supply side is just going to continue to see exits over time. You're also starting to see from the regulations. There's regulations in all modes, but the regulations in truckload are relevant and real, and they're on the front page of just about every paper right now. And so the English proficiency is a concern as it relates to drivers. The CDL renewal process and having to validate your work status, that's another regulation that's come into play. So you're starting to see drivers, and you can read about this just about everywhere, but the speculations are pretty violent, but they're pretty loud as it relates to, whether it's 20,000, 50,000, I've seen one as high as 600,000 drivers are going to leave the market. That's a lot of drivers, right? And so I think they're going to reset. But you're starting to see, bad actors get out of the market because the money's not there, and theft is the only answer. And so that supply thing is really starting to come down. And on the demand side of the fence, I think we have a couple of headwinds, but I think we're starting to see a little bit of calmness come. Obviously, the tariffs get weighed in tomorrow by the Supreme Court. And it'll be interesting to see what happens with the tariffs and the demand. And I think I could spend an hour just talking about this one slide. I think my summary statement is the ingredients are there for a shift. Now, the question is going to be, when is that shift? But we haven't had these ingredients the last 2 years. So we missed the shift call the last 2 years. I don't think we miss it this year or this time, because those new fresh ingredients are there that are going to stimulate, hopefully, a little bit of demand and a shift in this ecosystem. That's a lot. Sorry.
Well, no, that's helpful context, Jeff. And Mark, from your perspective, are there any sort of bellwethers or things that the audience could be looking out for that would, anticipate such a shift, right? Whether it be an, influx of import containers coming into the U.S. or anything along those lines that you think would be interesting bellwethers for a shift in the freight market?
Yeah, that's right. I think you got to look at the net effect, because for every one of these positives on one side of the ledger, there's a potential negative on the other side, which has really been the case, for the last 2 years. I'm going to go on record and admit that for the last 2 years, I got it wrong. The second half of the year is when it was happening. I said it every year, and I'm going to say it again in the third year. And the reason for this is that I think there's actually a strong possibility of the orange line. There's a lot of negative things that are happening, even with the Fed doing a 25 basis point cut. Uncertain in December, we'll see. There's a little bit of positive news on the trade front with the Chinese ships fees, right? That could hopefully cause some increase in imports in a short period of time. But the green line absolutely will happen. And Jeff said it right. It's not a matter of if, it always happens. It's a matter of when. And in order for that green to happen, it's almost as if the orange line needs to and shake some of the supply out. Demand is not just going to snap back. It will increase, but it's going to take some time. But supply can come out really fast. And once supply comes out, the first thing we'll see is spot rates start spiking up. And all of a sudden, it's like, wait a minute, I was playing the spot market. Now it's still expensive. I want to put more on my carriers that I didn't commit to. And then they're not going to take your load, which is then going to put more pressure on the spot rate. So to me, that is the indicator that it's already happening. The macroeconomics, we've got to figure out what is the net impact, because every week there's new announcements and one's a pro and one's a con. My best estimate is that there's a little bit more pain before there's some serious relief. And if it's not the back half of next year, it's going to be, the beginning of 27.
All right. So Mark, maybe the third time's the charm, I guess, is what I'm hearing from you.
That's what I'm banking.
You'll get it right.
Yeah, it's coming.
So what I'm, and once again, Jeff and Mark, you're not carriers who are saying, hey, it's going to happen. Revenues are going to go up. This is really, taking a look at the market from a shipper side, from a carrier side, given, all the inputs and really, things could go down a little bit further, but that's going to drive more supply out of the market. And then it's going to get to a point where, there's only one place for rates to go. Otherwise, people won't be shipping things.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So that will be our 2026 outlook. More runway for rates to go up than there is to go down. I think that's the overall overarching statement or kind of expectation. Be on the lookout for the supply and demand drivers in the market. The truckload market is, really a commodity market. So any reductions in supply and or increases in demand are really going to shift things. So with that, we'll move on to, given the fact that there's not a lot of runway for rates to go down any further without driving significant supply out of the market. And where are shippers going to drive value in their supply chains? And so how is, for the past, since the COVID years, for the past 2-3 years, you've just been able to go out to market, RFP, increase your carrier base, get 10% reduction, 12% reduction year over year. With that drying up, I want to get into how technology can be that lever that shippers and carriers can use together to drive out waste out of the ecosystem. And to kind of illustrate that, I think it's helpful to provide context to the audience on, what are some areas that, shippers can influence based on the way they collaborate and communicate with the carriers. So here, Jeff and Mark, I've highlighted based on our previous discussions ahead of the webinar, areas where you thought, hey, shippers can have an effect on these costs. Mark, I'll start with you. How can shippers influence carriers' costs? That seems a little bit counterintuitive.
Well, actually, they can impact the profit as well with the price they're willing to pay, but we'll just put that to the side. SG&A is an area where a shipper can have a material impact by being a better customer, by being a better shipper, connecting with them with their technology versus having phone calls, having emails, constantly harassing the customer service team, having changes all of the time. and not necessarily providing them with a good outlook of what their demand is, right? And so there's constant, just adjusting for, change in operations. That also impacts those non-revenue miles. The one thing that, we didn't talk about earlier with the rates going down, rates are going down because demand is going down. There's just less abundant freight out there. You can't pick and choose. So non-revenue miles, we're seeing with some carriers are going up because they have to travel a little bit farther to get the next load to keep the truck moving. And that's something where if you have better communication and better commitment with your core carriers, they can plan around the expectation of your shipment before it's even tendered to them, and you start to make the system a little bit more efficient. And the labor one is a big deal. And this is one where you have to put yourself in the shoes of the truck driver. It's a hard job. And trucking companies, they spend money on the equipment, they got to keep it maintained, and that's a big deal. But the driver is such an important individual, such an important member of the team. And a truck driver wants to keep moving. They don't want to sit and wait for you to eventually get to them to load or unload the trailer, right? So having, trailer pools obviously are an attractive feature. But making sure that your scheduling is, for the deliveries and for the pickups is a smooth, efficient, and easy process for them. And then when they get there, to treat them with respect and to make sure that, they're not wasting a ton of time. That time has a material cost. There's hours of service, there's regulations. If you're not a smart shipper, you're paying more, period, full stop. And, the vehicle, you can't really impact that. And fuel, perhaps being smarter about non-revenue miles and then burning fuel because of you have, but the ones that I've hit on, especially the labor and wasting the time of the driver, that's the biggest one. And if you're known as a shipper of choice and a customer that they want to work with, you will pay less. If you're known as someone who's difficult, you're going to pay more. It's that easy. It's that simple.
That's interesting, Mark. And I want to go to Jeff and say, Jeff, as a 4PL, do you see this in practice, right? Do you see your customers who are known as kind of, shippers of choice perform better from a rate perspective as compared to shippers that are a little bit more difficult, maybe provide less advanced notice, are not integrated from an EDI or API perspective? Is that true?
1000% yes. And I would tell you, we'll go a layer deeper and tell you that, obviously with technology Redwood has or can deploy, or just TMSs that are generally adopted in the at the shipper level, you can retain the information, and carriers can retain the information. Like, we've all gotten smarter as it relates to the experiences we've had in retaining the information. So you can flag locations and addresses that say problem, or you can flag locations and addresses in shipper and say, I want more of that freight. And so the technology is giving us the ability to weigh and measure that as it relates to procurement. And Mark brings up great points. There are all line items now in procurement events, but these are levers that we pull. Sure, the net rate is net revenue per mile. Yes, of course. But these are all levers that we get to pull that sits there and says, hey, listen, we know you're a headache. Right. And the carriers, by the way, you'd think like 3PLs, we retain all this data in a data lake and we know bids and we can see patterns and cycles. The carriers are just as good at it. And they're sitting there saying, I know that bid, I know that customer, I have a do not ship list. LTL carriers have this information too. Like, this isn't just to the truckload side of the fence. It is more prevalent than ever. The technology affords us the ability to give us the information we need to pull the right levers, and it works in both ways. Pull them down to get the best rate because you are a shipper of choice and you understand the pains and pressures, or pull it up because we understand that we're gonna, to Mark's point, we're gonna sit for a day outside of your appointment, and that's just that's dead miles for my truck for 24 hours. Or we're gonna show up to a facility on Friday night 2 hours late and they roll us to Monday. Those are crippling effects to the optimization of a truckload environment. And I think this is a great slide for people to learn on the pressures that the truckload industry is facing right now. And I would tell you that this is an aggressive model. I would tell you that 5 is probably best in class right now. And it's -5 for a lot of carriers right now. And it's been like that for a while. But I think the point is that profit column is the net result of the other 5 columns. right? And those have gone up, and that's important for the shippers to understand, to help the carriers eliminate waste, help forge relationships and understand the pain and that they go through, and kind of see the future. I think Mark did a great job of framing that out, but help them say, hey, listen, I have another load for you, or I have a load in 3 days, it's not today. That advanced information of available capacity or available demand is fantastic for carriers to help position and understand what they need to do. So categorically, I would tell you that shippers need to be smarter about this, but also tell you that never ever stronger than we're the strongest we've ever been as it relates to retaining data to make strategic pricing decisions on behalf of our customers, shippers, and carriers.
All right. So it is true that, being a shipper of choice, I like the way you described it. I guess I didn't realize this in the market that, carriers are kind of rating their shippers behind the scenes and on platforms. And I think, like we have rideshare scores, I guess as personal people, but I guess shippers have that as well from a carrier perspective. And that's interesting. And you're saying that 100% drives pricing and more aggressive pricing for those shippers of choice. So for those audience members out there, I think that's a really important takeaway here is that, even with rates sideways and with profit margins, paper thin for a lot of carriers, there is a way to act on better rates, and that is by becoming a shipper of choice, communicating electronically, communicating in advance, and keeping the shipper or keeping the carrier's trucks moving on your sites. If I summarize kind of those three top things that Mark and Jeff mentioned, those will help you lower your cost to ship by becoming a a shipper of choice.
And James, I'm going to add one other point related to this. We said earlier that the carriers are kind of in survival mode. We got to survive this tough market trough, and then we're going to come out on the other side okay, just like we have in the past. For many carriers, it's not survival mode now. They're into desperation. And so they'll tolerate a lot of the stuff that's completely controllable by a shipper because they just don't have any other choice. And so I think when you asked me earlier, can rates go lower? Everything can always go lower, right? But what do you get for it? Remember, you get what you pay for. So you can force it lower and then you force them out. And then your next best alternative is a massive step change, and shame on you for doing that. So you gotta be very careful right now. It's a period where you can get away with some sins in how you're treating these aren't just suppliers. A carrier is a partner. That's the last contact between your good and your customer. And so, you gotta be very careful. But all as we get into the next page and the next kind of piece of content, I think that the connecting with the information, like Jeff said, it sort of democratizes what used to be big, large shippers had departments with a lot of experience and they knew all this stuff. And same thing with the larger carriers and who everyone was. Now you can be a startup and you can start gathering that data in these systems and you can score it. Every qualitative feat of value, you can put a quantitative value for. In terms of wasting my time, it gets a 2, right? And cancels a day in advance, that gets a 1. And all of a sudden, you've got your own market intelligence that you've created with just a year or so of experience. And decisions are made based on those scorings. That's for sure.
Thanks, Mark. All right. So we talked about what shippers can do, but I think there's also another side of this, which is, of course, the carrier side. And some carriers, I think, don't necessarily realize maybe the lack of data or lack of information some of their shippers are working with, or really just the lack of understanding of the carrier operation and how certain shipper decisions affect that carrier's cost structure. So Jeff, based on your experience, can you talk about some of the data that would be interesting for carriers to share back with their shippers and how that could potentially affect the cost structure of the overall shipping ecosystem between those two parties?
Sure. And each one of these has kind of like a technology component attached to it, but obviously we kind of want to focus on some of the themes that are out there that I think the industry's done a good job adopting. I just think now more than ever, based on where we are in a post-pandemic cycle and this freight recession we've been surviving through, the change in rates in this market dynamics, as we've all said, is coming. And I think this is what we're prepping for. We're prepping for an easy transition to what used to be a pre-pandemic world. And so it's really important for carriers to adopt like these three pillars, in my opinion, which is like you have to be transparent. Supply chains can and do adopt. 4PLs, 3PLs, brokers, shippers, they all can adopt to a late truck. It's not good, but they can adapt. There are things that they can do. You just need to be transparent. Another thing that's kind of rampant in our industry right now is fraud. So it's really important for us to understand who the carriers are, who's picking up the load, and is it a relationship that you have. So being transparent about your qualifications, your ability to haul the load, and what you're doing for the shipper, it's never been more important. As it relates to accuracy, this has to do with how quickly you get paid, but more importantly, where are you at in your load? Are you truly 2 hours away? Are you dropping and hooking somewhere? But being accurate in the transmission of the data, that's not just basically core shipment events like, yes, I picked up, yes, I delivered. Those are pillars or two pillars, end pillars that we consider. But there are other accuracy components that are in there, up to and including acceptance of a load, acceptance of a rate, and properly transmitting an invoice. And then the next one I would tell you is from a carrier perspective is the frequency of transmissions needs to go up, right? I think this is one of those areas where AI is coming. But we also need to pay attention to how quickly are we transmitting data back to the shipper so that they can adapt to the transparent information that's being transmitted to them. But they need to be frequent in the transmission so that we can react, whether it's an intermediary or the shipper itself. Frequency is king. And I would only carve that out to sit there and say all of these things that I've just mentioned are supported by off-the-shelf technologies. They're supported in a cell phone. Everybody's got a smartphone in the bed of their truck. They can transmit this information. Images are now digital, and most trucking companies have already adopted a lot of this. It's just a matter of bringing it up a level, and so that the shippers, to our point from our previous slide, can help them. Right. I think that's the key is can you get the shipper to help them with all the efficiencies we're targeting in their network by leveraging all the information that the carriers can send. But the carriers do need to up their game and be a little more transparent. And the technology, the off-the-shelf technology already exists. Some of them just need to adopt it.
Thanks, Jeff. That's helpful. And as we continue on, we talked about, hey, that off-the-shelf technology, what does that look like? Here we've put together for the audience, kind of a classic shipment cycle, right? Going from the RFP carrier selection all the way through the cash conversion or the freight bill audit pay step. So here, we've outlined some of the technologies. You'll see many of these repeat, but technologies that carriers and shippers can use to improve the efficiency of these steps. Of course, this wouldn't be a presentation in 2025 if we didn't have the AI in the center of that. But that's not meant to be just hyperbole. There is AI that's being embedded with especially TMS systems to support clients. We're not going to go dig into that in this webinar. That could be a whole separate webinar in and of itself. I'm happy to field any questions in the Q&A. But we're going to focus on the shipment cycle. So with that, Mark, can you go into how you're seeing these technologies within these different shipment cycles, and are these really benefits that the market is seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by saying, if you have a business that revolves around shipping goods to customers, and you don't have a technology solution for each one of these 5 areas, that is before the shipment and planning to executing and tracking, and then the financial resolution at the end or reconciliation at the end, you're missing the boat here. I mean, this is table stakes to compete. And if you think about some of the more recent startup companies that are leveraging literally crowdsourced labor to drive in their used station wagon with kids in the back on the way to soccer to deliver a package, and you tracked it and saw it all the way to your door with a picture of it, then this is the expectation of a consumer. Every consumer that is employed has a job. Those people that have jobs in the industries that we're talking about, they have that experience because that's their real life. And so you've got to be able to deliver on that for the business that isn't e-commerce fulfillment, or maybe it is. But the RFP and carrier selection, that collaboration, that's sort of a depending upon the size of the company or the seasonality of the business, a once a year or once per season kind of activity where you set it up. And then the rest of this is more, kind of daily and weekly transaction. This does not have to cost a lot. I said before, some of these technologies really democratize smaller players or new startups. There's a solution for everyone out there with wide ranges of sophistication, but you got to do it. It's all about, you have to do it. You have to commit that this matters. And if you don't, I think you're going to find that very quickly you're falling behind the competition, and customer expectations are definitely not going to be met. And nothing on here is new or cutting edge in the last decade. It's just maybe there's newer versions that are web-based and cost less, but they still accomplish kind of the same end goal.
And Jeff, from Redwood's perspective, I know you enable a lot of these as a modern 4PL. Are you seeing smaller companies who maybe traditionally wouldn't have the size, back 20 years ago to implement an on-prem TMS? How realistic is this, I guess is what I'm trying to say, for some of these smaller shippers to implement these technologies? Is that realistic, or are they going to be forever stuck in the world of emails and phone calls?
I mean, I guess it has a little bit to do with how positive they are on their growth, right? So the smaller companies that have juice to squeeze, or they know it's going to get better and they're going to grow and they've got a competitive advantage. Early adoption into this process is critical for their success. The supply chain is, to Mark's point, it's the user experience, it's the customer journey. And the supply chain supports all of that. So we always coach our smaller customers to say, hey, you have to invest in this. This is strategic. You have a competitive advantage that you're going to market with, but you need a supply chain to substantiate that growth. And it's really important that you look at it. And so that's great as it relates to growth. And then you get into the more SMB or mid-sized customers, they're trying to just chronically optimize. And I would just tell you, there are some modes in this space, right? Like truckload, I think we've beat this horse from a procurement level. The rates can't go much lower, right? So we've whipped that one pretty good. There are other modes that are out there that are starting to yield some, but procurement is just, it's the introductory tool to build a data set so that you can build a dynamic supply chain and a dynamic TMS, right? Like it gives you the initial data set, but you still have to contract those carriers. You have to build a relationship with those carriers. Contracts have never been more important. I mean, with the fraud that's in the industry, as well as with damage and claims and what the fine print is in those contracts, these carriers and brokers that are selected by shippers, those contracts are just as important. So a lot of people lose sight of the fact, I'm just going to run a procurement event, get my answer, lower my rates, send it to my CFO and say, I'm awesome, right? And what ends up happening is like, we actually are trying to coach our each one of our customers to go a layer deeper, right? Pay attention to steps 2 through 5. That's where supply chains are truly getting optimized right now. That's where technology is really helping them. It's about seeing the future to understand that, hey, listen, every Tuesday I have these 2 shipments. How do I optimize those? How do I level my load so I don't inadvertently create my own spot market? There's nothing worse than the shipper that has 10 brand new truckloads on the end of month, end of quarter, and expects his contract rate to hold. Right, we automatically introduce some overspend or some risk into that supply chain, and load leveling is a great methodology to deploy there, but that comes through steps 2 through 4, and you need to really kind of hyper focus on those areas to be successful as we go forward.
Okay, and so to tie this back to the carrier cost structure that we mentioned, hey, here's the areas you can influence. So, for example, the SG&A piece, I think we're talking about freight bill audit pay. We're talking about shipment execution and visibility, all that tracking and tracing that traditionally done via email or phone call. A lot of that can be automated now, helping the carrier save and become more efficient from their support center costs. And when we think about the out of route miles there, I turn to the load tender and acceptance, right? Providing that advance notice will allow that that carrier better reposition assets and reduce the empty miles they're driving between loads. And then on that labor piece, right? If we go back to item number 4, even item number 3, when we think about automated appointment scheduling at warehouses, and warehouses that just stick to their appointment schedules and are able to operate efficiently, right? That's going to drive that detention waiting time that the shipper would eventually pay, but that's extra cost in the entire system that no one needs, right? So those are some tangible examples here for the audience on how you can leverage some of these items here to directly affect some of those cost components that we mentioned earlier. To wrap things up, I want to move to our last couple slides here. We talked about those technologies, and here I wanted to illustrate to the audience, what these technologies look like in terms of how do they interact with each other, right? So you have collaborative RFP tools that are used to kind of establish rates and find the best fit carriers. Those can communicate and dispatch those rates into the TMS. You've got the TMS, which is really that central knot between the carriers and all the shipping locations, right? And this could be shippers, it could be shipping outbound, it could be shipping inbound, and it's connecting with the carriers. But Jeff, Redwood has really done I think a good job of bringing this into a modern era. So can you talk about some of the things that Redwood's doing in terms of this technology ecosystem and how to simplify it for smaller shippers?
So it's important to kind of frame this up, like, again, and I think you mentioned it, James, is like, this isn't rocket science. This is about taking this model existed pre-pandemic, and we were heavily invested in making our customers smarter with technology and tools. Then the pandemic hit and was just like, oh my God, please move my freight, right? And then post-pandemic, it was like, okay, now I can't ever experience that again. So now where are all my vendors? Am I going to near shore? Do I have a redundancy in my supply chain? We had labor unrest just before the pandemic and during the pandemic as it relates to unions. And so like the supply chains kind of went through a complete reset at the post-pandemic. And now we're in a freight recession where procurement just is king and rates are rates and trucks are everywhere and everybody can pick up freight and there's no demand. And so I think we're starting to move all the way back to where it's like, hey, where do we invest? And I would tell you this, that the collaborative RFP tools exist. They're fantastic. TMSs are generally adopted for the most part. And whether they're used to their fullest capability is a completely different discussion. But it is a readily available technology that doesn't require significant investment. What does require investment and strategic outlook are these arrows. And they're often overlooked. People look at the blocks and go, yeah, I got it. And it's like the arrows are actually really important. And getting the integrations so that we can be transparent, we can be frequent, we can be accurate in the data. It is really important to understand where are these arrows being connected, how quickly are they being translated, and most importantly, are they stable? You'd be amazed at the frequency of bad data that's transmitted or transmissions that fail, and companies don't have an indicator to the failure, right? So they'll sit on 2 weeks of a downtime and not understand something. And so from a Redwood perspective, it's really important for us to take our customers through that tech journey and really pay attention to those arrows, because you can unplug and plug those shipper locations pretty frequently. And you can unplug and plug in those carrier boxes pretty frequently. But imagine a world where you insert 4 different WMSs. Imagine a world where you insert 3 different Mexican plants in Mexico, 1 in Canada, and a vendor in Asia, right? And so now all of a sudden, all of those different technologies have to tie off, if only at a data layer, but they have to tie off. And so we're really kind of coaching our customers through your supply chain can and should change. It is just making sure that change is properly connected to the processes that are best in class for your organization.
And interesting that you mentioned, Jeff, that TMSs in North America really are pretty abundant and common. But I heard you say underutilized TMS. So Mark, I want to turn that over to you. And based on some of your experience working with these shippers, have you seen underutilized TMSs, and what does that impact for the shipper?
Yeah, so we had 2 slides previously that kind of showed different technology before, during the shipment, and then after, right? And different ways to go about it, different systems that you would invest in. The TMS is part planning, part execution, but what you feed it with and the way you communicate to the carriers, Jeff was mentioning, that's where there requires some effort. That's where it requires some commitment to provide information, to the carriers. And so where I've seen it fall down is where you're not providing a good forecast to your customer. You're just basically using it for transactions. And then you find, well, because you didn't communicate, because you weren't transparent, you're getting a lot of tender rejection. So then it's like, well, how much time is this going to take? And all of a sudden, it's not working. So what do? The person then starts picking up the phone. And so you've got a TMS that effectively is a rotary telephone because it's not working as designed because you're unwilling to commit to everything that it takes for this to work seamlessly. I mean, some of the most boring stuff here, the connectivity, if you have no connectivity, it doesn't work, right? So that's where people, and I think Jeff said it well. It's like, the arrows are the boring ones no one wants to look at. It's that is how you get the system to work smoothly. And just paying the money for the software, loading some rates with some carriers with no real communication other than you've got a planner that sends them loads and it's all over the place. And you're price shopping now and you go to the cheapest guy and you have a procurement person who puts another load in, it's a penny amount, you start giving loads to them. All of a sudden it goes haywire. It's because the fundamentals of communication and planning aren't there. And so that first step in this chain, if that's broken, the rest of it's not going to be, very good either.
Thanks, Mark. And to round things out, we're here on our last slide here. So I'd ask the audience as you start to collect your thoughts and think of anything that we've left untouched, please feel free to put any of your questions in the Q&A and we'll go ahead and start reading those. I see some coming in already, so great. But with that, Jeff, Mark, we mentioned, hey, this technology isn't rocket science and it's actually, pretty available depending on the how large the organization is and what they're looking to do. Here we have some examples that we've collectively put together of what exists out there. Jeff, I'll start with you. How realistic is here when I see on the TMS section, right? You can have a TMS implementation in 2 months. What does that mean and what does that entail, a 2-month implementation for TMS that probably sounds unbelievable to some folks on the call?
It depends on the complexity and then most importantly, the data enrichment that the customer has. We have found success deploying technology and TMSs in short of 2 weeks. But 2 months is already an aggressive timeline, but it's usually the workflows are static and pre-built and it's kind of all out of the box. And the arrows or plugins are pretty redundant or non-existent, right? We're just beginning the tech journey with our customers. And when we begin the tech journey, it is more about moving freight, aggregating data, and then making strategic decisions on what's the next layer of TMS that's out there. But the journey can start in its infancy or it can grow. We also have a ton of organizations that have, legacy green screens and just technology that basically needs a massive upgrade. And they need a full diagnostic TMS and data mapping exercise. That takes us a little bit time. And we see that trend. Traditionally, the right ones are right around about 9 to 12 months. And even then, it's kind of it's an MVP product, right? We're close. We're not fully there, but we see a roadmap to how to get there. And that's where that 18-month journey comes in, is like, how quickly can I get an MVP built and have use practices ready to go? And then over time, we'll continue to tweak and manipulate it. But I want to kind of carve out 2 big things. The success in both of these things requires like change management, the desire for the customer to change carriers, change the way things are done. Change management's critical. And then you don't need to have the data. You just need to admit that you don't have the data, right? And so a customer that understands and is self-aware that their master data files may be flawed, they may be fundamentally old, they may be stuck, and they may not exist. And it's that transparent relationship with the customer that wants to adopt this supply chain to a tech enrichment like practice and policy. Those are the customers that need to understand that just knowing where your data is and how we can configure it, that's the best way for us to optimize TMSs and for you guys to get, for the shippers to get 15, 20, 30% of a save or an ROI has to come from that mapping of the data through the system, because we want to automate it. You want to optimize the order, turn it right into a shipment intended to a carrier that's ready for it. That's the dream scenario. And if you want to tie it to an inventory level and an import, that's even better. To go deeper in the supply chain on the material side or the order and inventory side, those are all things that are capable in a TMS, which is why I made that comment. A lot of them are malnourished. They're not utilized to the capabilities. They have significant outreach. It's just about establishing the right journey and understanding where the data is coming from.
Thanks, Jeff. And with that, I want to get over to the Q&A. But before I do, I just want to summarize, everything we've talked about for the audience here. Starting with 2025. 2025 has been an incredibly boring year. Rates are extremely depressed on the truckload side of things. Factoring in fuel, they're actually lower than 2020. Not a lot of room for those truckload rates to continue to fall. Can happen. However, that's going to drive additional supply out of the market, which will then have an effect on the market dynamics. When we think about LTL has remained, has not fallen. However, it's grown at a rate that we haven't seen in a while. It's been very slow to grow. And there's been a tonnage reduction that's been tendered to the LTL providers. So they're scraping a way to actually go ahead and sweat their assets. And then we think about 2026, probably more room for pricing to go up than to go down. Base case is probably a slight increase. And the question on the green line, if you recall, that the larger increase is not if, but when, according to both Jeff and Mark. And so given that, and given the limited ability to go ahead and use pricing to reduce costs, we have technology that we can leverage and information sharing between carriers and shippers to reduce costs in the ecosystem related to SG&A, related to empty miles or non-revenue miles, and related to the carrier's labor, right? Where carriers and shippers working together, leveraging technologies like we have on the screen now, collaborative RFP tools, TMS systems, and really EDI and API connectivity to Jeff and Mark's point, that's kind of that critical factor that's often overlooked. Using those technologies, you can actually drive out costs of the carrier. You can become a shipper of choice, and you can go ahead and reduce your costs that way because the carrier is reducing their costs as well. So, with that, I want to turn to a couple Q&A questions that we have. The first one is, we did not mention the Canadian or Mexican freight markets. Mark, Jeff, any comments on those markets? Are they kind of, same as the US, or are there any nuances or differences there?
There are a ton of differences, but I think the key to, when you look at those two markets, one is obviously it's international trade, and we have an executive office that has some conflicts and has some tariff positions. That one of them has material impacts as it relates to the heavy truck tariff. And so I think it's important to understand that outside of just the fact that it's surface transportation and the trucks are the same, the highways, the trucks are the same as it relates to dry van. I think there's some rules and regulations in different countries to pay attention to. But for the most part, it is just a truck crossing a border with the freight, whether it's transloaded or not. So the surface transportation is prevalent. It's a core mode. Nearshoring is an incredible theme for both organizations and major supply chain. So yes, they're very different, but they are all very much tied together, especially because all roads connect, and the number one trade partner amongst those three countries are each other, right? And so that dynamic is North American without a doubt, but each one of them have their own little bucket. So my coaching is for the carriers or customers in that space, you have to go a layer deeper. You have to go a layer deeper on your customs brokerage. You have to go a layer deeper on rules and regulations and insurance. You have to go a layer deeper on your rates. I would tell you that the balance of trade between these countries is significantly lopsided. And so go a layer deeper. They are very, very different, despite the fact that all the roads connect to each other.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. I've got a couple of questions kind of surrounding a similar theme here, and that is consolidation of carriers, both FTL and LTL. Do we anticipate any sort of, or based on what you're seeing and what you've seen in the past, do either of you anticipate consolidation in the truckload market and or the LTL market? Mark, I'll kick it over to you to start that one off.
Yeah, well, the M&A market for transportation has been kind of quiet over the last year or so, other than the mega rail deal that was announced earlier this year. I think that interest rates are going to have to come down a little bit more. I also think we need a little bit more certainty around the economy and where the growth's going to come, because any investor who wants to fund a deal could fund something else. And over the last 12 months, they'd be better off funding AI than funding any kind of transportation deal, because that's where the action is and that's where the growth is. But at some point, we will see that. And I mentioned AI, and I think that's something that if I was a listener here, I'd be asking, or I'd be thinking about, where does that come into play? And I think it comes into play in all of these areas. I think the challenge here is that AI is not cheap. AI isn't free. Free AI isn't what's driving NVIDIA's, share price and Palantir and all the others. Okay. Yes, you can do some AI powered Google searches, which is great, especially for the item number one here, collaborative RFP tools. You can go create some new carrier lists and you can do some research fast on the TMS and communication between parties. There's a significant customer service element that's still present in these companies. Agentic AI for a larger carrier can help take labor cost out and do some of that work. But for someone who grew up in the Pennsylvania area in the late 90s, AI is the answer, right? Allen Iverson. It's not the answer for a small shipper because you can't afford it yet. Okay. But eventually that is going to help to streamline a lot of the human element to kind of massage the data or to make that communication just right. And we're just starting to scratch the surface. The companies in the space that have come out publicly and announced making significant headway with AI are by far the largest, because they can afford to pay for it. And by the way, it works. It really does work, but it's also expensive. And so you've got to, at least for now, just like all these technologies are. 25 years ago, when I started my career in the traffic department, and we were talking about an internet-enabled RFP, it was like $1 million to run one. Now it's not that by any stretch of the imagination. So I want to make sure that the audience doesn't feel like that was omitted. But just like building a house, if you don't have a strong foundation, all the fancy fun stuff above doesn't matter. And we want to reinforce, you got to have the fundamentals. You got to have the foundation built strong before that, cutting edge technology can really make a difference, and it will. You just got to be ready.
Thank you, Mark. We've got one last question. I think this should hopefully be an easy answer. It's talking about, hey, the compounding factor of labor potentially going up due to some of the DOT actions, not just among drivers, but also, at the terminals and some of the other areas of the organizations, making labor a little bit more scarce or more expensive, combined with the Fed cutting interest rates. So essentially driving the supply of trucks down while simultaneously driving demand up. I think, that gets back to that green chart we're showing, right, on the 2026. That's what's going to cause kind of that spike, right? And then, so Jeff, Mark, any quick comments on that piece?
No, I mean, the question's well put. I would tell you that those are one or two of a couple of core components that we're keeping an eye on, that we see truly as catalysts for a raising rate environment. But it's two of about 20 right now that we have to look at. I think Mark's point and my point is, if all 20 hit, we're going to see a quick acceleration of rates, and it'll happen sooner. I don't think that'll happen. But there are a number of things that can either stimulate the demand side of the fence. And I would tell you that supply doesn't need any help. It's gonna keep coming out. But those regulations from the government are gonna make it go faster at a rate and pace we didn't expect, and it's not going away. So I think both of them are real. And Mark mentioned it earlier. Again, the executive office and the Fed office aren't aligned. Right. And I think you see that in the December rate commentary that they've made. That needs to change. I think that's on slate for Q2 of next year. So I would just surmise this is that there's a lot of inputs, but I do think that for the first time in this freight recession, we're starting to see a significant amount of inputs, and those inputs being like pushed a little bit that are gonna change the rate dynamic and the supply chain dynamic globally.
Thanks, Jeff. And Mark, any last comments before we close the webinar?
The only thing that I will tell you, and it's great advice, no matter what you're doing, you better have a plan B because you're going to need it. I just don't know when, but you are eventually going to need it. And, you know, there's going to be an event that's going to have a pretty significant impact to the market. And then things will shift pretty fast. And then if you don't have a plan B in place, you're going to end up paying a lot more in some way, shape, or form. We saw that prior to the COVID era, where people had fragile supply chains and no plan B, and you can actually calculate the cost of what it costs when you don't have that. I think you're going to see that now, and I would encourage both sides, the service providers and their customers, to be talking about not what we're doing today, not what we're doing tomorrow, but what are we going to do as this market changes, and how are we still going to work together and be happy with that arrangement, and, you know, start thinking about it now, not wait till it happens to you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jeff, as well, for your time. I hope the audience has found this helpful. If you're interested in implementing any of these technologies or talking more about them, or working with a company like Redwood that can make them easier and a lot faster to production, feel free to reach out. We look forward to any questions or additional comments from the audience via email. And thank you for your time. And I wish everyone a great end to 2025, and good luck planning for 2026. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Guys.